So we've been talking about progressivism and the progressive era, and there are really two, but sort of three progressive leaders that you should keep in mind during all of this. The first I talked to on the previous slide, and that was the governor of Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, known as Fighting Bob. So thanks to Fighting Bob and his time as governor of Wisconsin, he helped Wisconsin become known as the laboratory of democracy because he was very good at trying out new forms of government and trying new ideas to make the government work as efficiently as possible. I already talked about direct primaries, initiatives, and referendums being some of those. He also, listened to the Farmers Alliance, and he listened to the populists, and he forced railroads to lower their fees and raised taxes on railroads so that he could increase government regulation of them to help farmers in Wisconsin. He supported progressive changes, not just in how government works, but progressive changes across the board. He improved education. He improved working conditions in his state. He was able to accomplish a lot, even just on a state level, and he really became like the perfect example of what a progressive leader should be during this time. Next, we have there in the middle our dear Teddy Roosevelt. So we know that Teddy is going to be president, and his presidency, his whole domestic policy is called the Square Deal. He promised a square deal for every American. And basically what that means is fairness for every American. And that's something that he really stood by as president as well. He is going to regulate businesses more. He's going to, support cracking down on major industries that use their powers for, evil, not good. He's going to support the environment. He's going to help us with not having contaminated food and things like that. We already talked about the jungle. So Teddy Roosevelt is really the most progressive president that we have ever had. He's going to support a lot of progressive reforms when he's president. We'll talk more about those when we dig a little bit deeper into his into the Square Deal and into all of his presidency later on. And then last I have up here is Woodrow Wilson. And before we get to these next two ideas, I want to touch on Woodrow Wilson a little bit. Woodrow Wilson will win his election against Teddy Roosevelt. And when he is elected, he basically calls himself a progressive, and history books a lot of times label him as a progressive leader because when he was president, a lot of progressive forms were accomplished. The 19th Amendment was signed into law and a lot of things like that. However, as a human being, I personally, your teacher, would never consider Woodrow Wilson to be a progressive leader because in reality, Woodrow Wilson was a raging racist and sexist. And the progressive changes that were made for African Americans and that were made for women during his presidency was sheer accident and was in spite of him, not because of him. Now, we'll get into his domestic policy and stuff later on after we talk about Teddy Roosevelt's during a different video, but it could be that one of the reasons why those things were not a priority for Woodrow Wilson is because he was dealing with some larger issues, namely World War I. When he was president, we were fighting World War I, and I understand that many politicians and many presidents would place an issue like that over women's suffrage, over civil rights, over a lot of progressive reforms. However, I don't think it necessarily has to be one or the other. Woodrow Wilson, for example, is the president. You all remember last semester when we watched pieces of Birth of a Nation, that movie about the founding of the Klan. It was during Wilson's presidency that movie was released, and it was during Wilson's presidency that movie was the first film to ever be screened in the White House. And he is the president who claimed that movie was like history written with lightning, just to put things into perspective. All right, so moving on to much better moments for civil rights. So we've already talked about a little bit of this when we were getting into the Gilded Age. We talked about Booker T. Washington. If you remember, his take on segregation was accommodation. Blacks should accept segregation and disenfranchisement as somewhat unavoidable and should focus on self-help and self-improvement. His biggest critic is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African American to ever earn his PhD, and got it from Harvard, nevertheless. And he was really the biggest critic, saying that, you know, blacks should demand equality immediately because they already have equality as humans. They just need to be treated that way. So we start to see, thanks to these two men, as well as Ida B. Wells, if you remember her, the muckraker who wrote about lynching in the South, thanks to these leaders in the early civil rights movement, we're going to see a lot of problems brought to light. In 1900, between 1900 and 1914, over 1,000 black people were lynched in the United States, which means, executed by a mob. Without cause, basically, because they were black. And several race riots broke out all over the country during this time period. There was a pretty large one in Chicago. There was not really as many in the South, but there was a very big one in Springfield, Illinois, that W.E.B. Du Bois will use to prove to Booker T. Washington that his ideas are not necessarily the correct ones. In this race riot in Springfield, a white mob got together and started attacking African Americans and black-owned businesses, and things got so out of hand that they had to release like a 5,000-man militia to get everyone back to where they needed to be. And in the process of this mob attacking people before the military could arrive, 2 black men were lynched in the streets of Springfield. And this was in Illinois, so this isn't necessarily something that is, unique to the South, like I've said 1,000 times. This is a widespread problem, and a lot of times racists outside the South like to say that that's a Southern problem. Racial inequality is a Southern problem because they don't want to strive for racial equality in their state or recognize their own problems. And that's really been something that's been going on since slavery. All these other states have said, well, at least we don't have slavery, but that doesn't mean you have equality. And even now, just because you don't have Jim Crow doesn't mean you have equality. It's a problem nonetheless. It might not be as severe of a problem, but it's a problem. And here we see that the violence can come with those problems, regardless of where they're located. And the men that were lynched in that Springfield mob were wealthier and more prominent members of the African American community. And what this proved, Booker T. Washington's whole argument was that if blacks were educated and that they would succeed in business, that they would eventually just be accepted as equals by the white community. This showed that that was not true. It did not matter how wealthy or how successful in business African Americans were, white people were still going to be racist, and they were still going to resent their success, and they were still going to try to stop it by any means necessary. So all these moments here are going to give wave to the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. And this first wave of it we called the Niagara movement, because it began with a meeting in Niagara Falls in 1805, sort of led by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and several other prominent members of the African American and civil rights community at the time. What they want is the right to vote, to abolish segregation, and then abolish any other barriers to black advancement. They were committed to free speech. They spoke about a brotherhood of all people, respect for the working man, whether he was white or black. And then in 1910, that Niagara movement, the same men who began that will found the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So the original president of the NAACP is a man named Warfield Story. William Walling was the first chairman of their executive committee, and W.B. Du Bois was the first director of publicity and research. When we see the NAACP form, that's when we say that is the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. From that moment, I know when we talk about the modern civil rights movement, people always think of Dr. King and Malcolm X, but in reality, there were so many more men and women who were working for civil rights long before the two of them were, and put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears before they ever came. And they would have never had a platform if it wasn't for these people originally taking steps towards progress. So the NAACP is really a legal team. That's really what the core of it is. It is gaining equality in the law. And really the NAACP's first major legal battle in these first years was trying to stop Birth of a Nation from being released as a film. We know that failed, but that's really going to be the torch that the NAACP carries throughout the rest of the civil rights movement. When we get to talk about the civil rights movement, we'll talk about other organizations like SNCC and SCLC and CORE, and they organized a lot of protests and movements and marches and organizations and things like that. But what the NAACP was doing while they were marching is they were filing lawsuits, and they were, proposing legislation, and they were trying to get real changes made on a state and on a federal level. 1 year later, we're going to see the foundation of the National Urban League, and this is their logo right here, and that's an organization that's also still around today. And what they do is they try to help African Americans find jobs, they help them find housing, and they help African Americans who are moving from the South or more rural areas out into the city, to help them sort of make that transition from a rural area to the new city life, helping them find a job, helping them find a community, a place to live, all of that stuff. All right, so we've talked a lot about wanting to see progress in the women's movement, and we don't really see any progress through all of this progress that we see in terms of legislation for African Americans with the right to vote. There is no progress for women. I've told you before, seeing the 15th Amendment passed, giving Black men the right to vote, and still denying that right to women was such a slap in the face for the women's movement. And that's what really lit a fire underneath underneath Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony when they originally founded NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. By this time, by the Progressive Era, unfortunately, those women have passed, and they have not lived to see the women get the right to vote, but that torch will continue to be carried, and NASA will continue to work until their mission is accomplished. So the women's suffrage movement here during this progressive era is really going to have two sides. It's going to have the older side, the women who worked and had been trained by Susan B. Anthony, by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, women who had grown up in NASA, women who were wealthier and who had more connections in the federal government. That's one side, and that side is represented by this woman you see here on the left, Carrie Chapman Catt. She was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She was the president of NASA, and her strategy for gaining the right to vote was taking it state by state. She was really working on two things at a time. One, she was lobbying for a constitutional amendment, what will eventually be the 19th Amendment. She definitely wanted that, but she saw that as a lot more difficult to accomplish, and she thought that it would be possible to even make it quicker to get each state to individually allow women the right to vote. We know that during Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's time as suffragettes, they were able to get Wyoming to become the first state to allow women the right to vote. So at this point, there were probably about 10, maybe more states who already allowed women the right to vote. So she thought that that was a more logical path, just continue that state by state. She had a very good relationship with what we call society women, wealthier women, the upper class women. Those were the women of Carrie Chapman Catt, and she was generally more conservative, as was NASA. Now, the woman here on the right, Alice Paul, was a member of NASA, and she had originally been heavily involved in the suffrage movement in England. That suffrage movement was very different from the suffrage movement in the United States. It was much more radical, and it was much more violent. Women lost their lives for the right to vote in England, and that didn't happen in the United States. There was a woman who killed herself at a horse race that, dozens and dozens of major politicians and wealthy people were at, in the name of women's suffrage. There were women who would light politicians' houses on fire and throw bricks through their windows if they didn't vote in favor of women's agendas in Parliament, and if they didn't vote in favor of suffrage. And that is the type of suffrage movement that Alice Paul had been brought into. That was the type of suffrage movement she was used to, and she is representing a very different type of suffragette. She is representing women who are young. She's sort of like the new feminist. She's young, she's highly educated, but she favors the working woman. She favors equality, while the upper class and NASA women don't necessarily favor racial equality. Alice Paul definitely does, and Alice Paul is more of a by any means necessary. Carrie Chapman Catt is more of a Martin Luther King, is in the civil rights movement. That's sort of who she is for the women's rights movement. Alice Paul is more of a Malcolm X. By any means necessary is a very famous quote of his, and that's definitely something I would say Alice Paul lived by. She would have done whatever it took for women to get the right to vote, and she did not want to go state by state. She wanted a national amendment, and she wanted it to happen soon. So she took over NASA's campaign to get a national amendment, and Carrie Chapman Catt and her began to have some very different ideas, and finally Alice Paul split with Carrie Chapman Catt and founded her own organization called the National Women's Party, or the NWP. This group was much more outspoken, and they were much more radical than NASA was, and the most radical thing they ever did, the thing that they are known for the most, is this. They picketed the White House. Now, I know that sounds like, why is that? This is not radical. This is a bunch of women standing in front of the White House with flags and signs. This is not radical. But for 1916, this is very radical for multiple reasons. Number one, people did not protest in front of the president's front door back then. That was a very controversial thing to do. Number two, we were in the middle of World War I at this point. To picket a president is rude. To picket a wartime president is treason in a lot of people's minds. And people were very outspoken against these women. These women were physically attacked and beaten. They were dragged off of the sidewalks and slapped. They were, people, like men would go up and grab their flags and beat them with it. But they didn't care. Every single day, from sunup to sundown, there were women, rain, snow, sunshine, whatever, in front of the White House, and they would hold these signs. You see this one sign, this woman says it has, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And what these women did was they really called out Woodrow Wilson on his hypocrisy. He claimed that we were getting involved in World War I because we were wanting to preserve democracy, and we were wanting to protect and stand up for people who didn't have a voice and the ability to stand up for themselves in Europe, but we're denying more than 50% of our own country from having a voice in our own government. They would put quotes from Woodrow Wilson on these flags and use his own words against him, which was something that was definitely controversial. Many of these women were arrested, and finally Alice Paul was one of them. She was arrested and taken to prison and refused to pay a fine and refused to admit guilt. They were all charged with obstructing traffic, even though they were on the sidewalk. And when she was in prison, she went on a hunger strike, which was a tradition that she learned when she was involved in the suffrage movement in Europe, in England. And basically, you just refuse to eat until you get what you want. And she starved herself, and people, were hearing about Alice being sick and all this stuff, and like, the government, can't allow this poor woman to not eat. It makes them look like they're abusing her. So, she was force fed, and the process of force feeding involves prying open your mouth with a clamp, shoving a tube down your throat, and pouring raw eggs down it. They would do this to her multiple times a day, every day. It can cause major bleeding in your esophagus. It can cause bleeding in your nose. It can cause a nostril to collapse, severe vomiting, and she experienced all of those problems. Once the press got a hold of her story and what was going on, people really freaked out, and support for women continued to grow. So finally, the 19th Amendment was passed in the House of it was passed in Congress, which means at that point it has to be ratified by a certain number of states. The last state to ratify, I believe, was Tennessee, and the day that they voted, they were actually going to have not enough votes. And then one young senator who was sitting in, getting ready to vote, got a telegram from his mother, and we don't know what the telegram said, but we know that this man was originally going to vote no, but once he read the telegram from his mother, he got up and he voted yes in favor of women's suffrage, which is, I'm sure we can all imagine what his mom had to say. So thanks to that, the 19th Amendment was passed and signed into law in 1920, and Woodrow Wilson just sort of happened to be president and gets the credit for it.